Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to share my time with my friend and colleague, the member for Mount Royal. And in some senses, one could say that I only have three problems with this budget, which I'd like to address. First of all, it makes the wrong choices. Second, it really is very weak on accountability. And third, it attempts to balance the books on the backs of the most vulnerable in society. Other than that, I suppose you could say it's okay. But I would say those are three rather important points. Le budget fait des mauvais choix.
There are bad decisions in this budget. The budget lacks accountability, and the government tries to balance its budget on the back of the most vulnerable of our society. So I'd like to begin with the idea that the budget contains bad decisions. And I think that the worst decision probably in this budget is the government's decision to reduce the corporate tax rate on the biggest corporations, which costs $6 billion a year.
Bad choice. There's the untendered fighter jets, there's the billions on prisons, but this is $6 billion per year, which is a big chunk of the money available. Now, let me say we think prosperity and growth and innovation and productivity are crucial, but we don't think the best way to do that is through reducing the tax on the largest companies. We think it's better to either reduce the taxes on the smaller businesses or to have incentives to invest, like a 5-year period for accelerated capital cost allowance, or to have incentives like a flow-through share-type mechanism to encourage investments in green technology and high-tech industries. Those are just examples which we think are much more cost-efficient, cost-effective in raising productivity and promoting growth and innovation and jobs than the measure that the government took. But the net effect of this decision to proceed with tax cuts to the largest corporations is that it puts families at the back of the line. Either the families get a pittance, or the families have to wait several years, who knows how many, until the books are balanced. And we think, given that families are struggling to make ends meet, families should be at the front of the line, but rather than at the back of the line, which is where they are in this budget. And let me give you a few examples. In certain cases, families get something, but it's a pittance. The government spends $34 million to help students. Well, there's about 1 million students in Canada, so that's $34 per student per year. It makes no difference. The government spends money to help caregivers, but the maximum credit is $300. That's not going to be a material help for a caregiver looking after his or her loved ones. Then there are some more major measures, such as the income splitting measure, but that comes to nothing until the books are balanced. And the government claims that's after 3 years, 4 years, who knows how many years. So my point, Mr. Speaker, is that by doing these tax cuts for very large corporations, the government leaves families out. This is not the most effective way to stimulate growth and jobs, and it has the consequence that either families get a pittance now or a little bit more down the road. And we think that is the wrong approach. The second point, Mr. Speaker, is the lack of fiscal accountability. When we were government in 2005, we did find $11 billion over 5 years in savings, and we booked every item in the budget. So Canadians were clear exactly what item was being cut or saved, where it would come from, and what was going to happen as a consequence of these cuts. The problem with this budget is that Canadians don't have a clue as to where those cuts will come from, whose ox will be gored. We know a little bit coming out. There'll be lots of cuts in Newfoundland on fisheries. A little bit is coming out. But there's very little information in the budget knowing which services will be cut, which people will lose their jobs. Instead, what we get is what I would call weasel words, Mr. Speaker. We are told, for example, that the Department of Human Resources and Skills Development will have savings on the order of $500 million. Well, that's interesting. What cuts will they get for $500 million? Well, here's the answer taken straight from the budget. This is what they're going to do. Improve alignment of program funding with actual needs. Find efficiencies through improved program management and use of technology. Improve use of internal resources and administrative efficiency. Align program activities with core mandate. This is a good one. Refocus programming to benefit all Canadians. Well, Mr. Speaker, that's just gobbledygook. Those are weasel words. That doesn't tell Canadians anything at all about who is going to pay for these cuts, what services are going to be cut, and who is going to lose their jobs. All we get is these weasel words, Mr. Speaker, and that is why I say this budget is lacking in accountability. Finally, my argument is that my third point, c'est que le gouvernement essaie d'équilibrer son...
That the government is trying to balance its budget on the backs of the most vulnerable. And I'm talking about the most vulnerable not only in Canada, but in the rest of the world as well. And in particular, in last year's budget, the government froze funding for international development, CEDA funding. And in this budget, a quarter of the savings to balance the budget comes from the freezing of funds to international development.
From the previous year's budget, of all the savings that were found from restraining CEDA funding. So 1/4 of the savings to balance Canada's books came on the backs of the poorest people in the world who received cuts in their development assistance. And I would mark the contrast between the Canadian Conservative government, who got savings on the backs of the poorest people in the world, and the British Conservative government, which made an exemption for only 2 areas which would not get cuts. The 2 areas that would not get cuts were national health and international development. So whereas the British Conservative government singled out development assistance for specially preferential treatment, the Canadian government singled out international development assistance for especially negative treatment. And I think, Mr. Speaker, that is a prime example of balancing the books on the backs of the poorest people in the world. But this inclination to hurt the most vulnerable doesn't just go abroad, it also is true at home. We heard today in the supplementary estimates A that some of the money for affordable housing was being put back. But you know what was the one area where the cut of about $120 million was not put back at all? Housing on reserves. Well, there, Mr. Speaker, is probably the area of greatest need in this country. So they cut the money for reserves, they cut international development assistance, they provide firefighters and caregivers and music lesson goers with tax credits, but those tax credits are worth nothing if your income is low enough that you do not pay income tax. Donc, en conclusion, Monsieur le Président.
So in conclusion, Mr. Speaker, I would say that this budget makes bad choices